Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
This episode, a focus on writing, creativity, and everything in between. Andrea Gunn is a talented writer who has mastered the art of crafting words in various forms, from manuals and pamphlets to captivating magazine articles and compelling profiles. She has done it all. We'll explore the unique challenges of her diverse writing projects, from the concise clarity required in manuals to the vibrant storytelling of magazine articles and profiles. Andrea now works as a writer and editor for Tourism Kingston, a department of City Hall. We'll uncover the secrets behind creating engaging content that captures the essence of a city and entices visitors to explore its hidden treasures. Here is our conversation with Andrea Gunn. Andrea, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for giving us the time to sit down and chat. And we want to remind those of you who are listening to the podcast that we're recording this particular podcast in mid-May 2023. So let me start with this, if that's okay. Writing, to me, when I look at your resume, if you will, writing is a passion for you.
It is absolutely a passion.
And I'd like to know where that got started.
Oh, good question. I've always wanted to write. When I was little, I wrote stories. Both my parents were very creative. My father was a Queen's professor, and he wrote a number of books. So he was a researcher and writer. And my mother also wrote as a young woman and wrote stories for the kids, and they both encouraged my creativity.
So this was in your DNA from the start, almost.
I think so, yes.
Now, let me do something general here. I've had the opportunity to sit down and talk with other writers, a couple of other writers, specifically a fellow by the name of Jamal Saeed, who is a Syrian refugee who now lives in Kingston, who wrote a book about his life. And then another one is Stephen Lee Nash, who has written about movies and their impact on society and culture, those sorts of things. But the point here is that they've written books, so they've given themselves time and space to write a book.
Yes.
When you do your thing, you write articles or profiles, so you don't have, I would guess, as much space to play with,
yes,
or as much time to play with. So tell me a little bit about how you see the differences between the two kinds of writing.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, writing a book is something that's, always been in the back of my mind, something I want to do, and something I'm a little afraid to do. I think writing a book requires stamina and certainty that you're going to be able to finish, and you've got enough material, and you know where you're going once you start, and you're not afraid to do 80 drafts or rewrite the ending, or ditch your first draft and start again. So I admire people who do that. I wish I were one of those. Maybe I will be one day. Writing profiles, short articles, it can be challenging. Like, I love writing 3,000 word articles or profiles on someone. It gives me a little bit of room to explore their thoughts, their background, their feelings, their wishes, and get a little more descriptive. There's a saying that it's harder to write short than it is to write long. I don't think it means that it's harder to write a short profile than it is to write a novel or a feature-length piece. But I think it's much harder to write a 500-word profile of someone than a 3,000-word profile of them and still remain true to them.
What do you put in? What do you leave out?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also, when I interview someone, I want to do them justice. I want to, if they're telling me a story about their childhood or about their career that they're really passionate about and they want to talk to someone about that, if I don't have room for all of that, I need to be able to pull out the salient points without cutting too much and without them feeling like I was, paying them short shrift and just brushing over something that was very important to them.
So when an editor gives you an assignment, what's the first thing you think about?
The first thing I think about, if I'm working with another editor, I will ask about the audience if I don't know who the audience is. That's the first step for me. Who am I writing for? Because I really have two audiences. The first audience is the reader, whether it's in a college magazine or on a website. And the second audience is the person I'm interviewing, because I want them to be proud of that work. Mm-hmm. So after I find out about the audience, I'll ask about the interviewee, and then any background information. What does the editor want me to talk about? What do they want me to stay away from? I always say, what do we want the reader to know at the end of this article?
Yeah. I would guess that a lot of what you write about is not something that you know much about to start with.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
So let's take an article that I read that you wrote in a magazine that is put out by a local community college, and it's called Voyageur. And if people want to access it, they can go online and find it. It's called Building Blocks. Yes. And I want you to sort of compare the time you would spend researching versus writing versus editing, assuming you're editing your own article.
Yes, well, I would be editing my own article before I submit it to my editor, in this case at the magazine, knowing that that editor may make more changes, but I want to get it in as great shape for that person as possible. So for that article, I interviewed a number of people at the local college and in different programs. And I, in fact, interviewed more people than appeared in the article. In one of those cases of I didn't have enough space, and there are just so many people to talk to. And they were program directors who were creating new programs, either to get people more skills, if they were nurses, if they're already working in their field and wanted to upgrade their skills, or people who are entering the workforce, or people who had barriers to employment, such as recent inmates who had been released to the community and were looking for work. So there are so many interesting stories. So I spent a lot of time just talking to people, doing a bit of background, so I knew how long each program had run, that sort of thing. But obviously I'm not an expert on carpentry, nor do I need to be to interview somebody who teaches a carpentry course. I can let them tell me what I need to know and what they teach their students.
If I compare what I do to what you do, so when I do this podcast, I am looking for questions that will trigger stories or longer form answers from the person I am talking to. So I don't need to have probably anywhere near the kind of preparation that you do. So if you were talking to folks as you did in preparation for this article, so you were talking to a whole pile of different people about a whole pile of different programs. Mm-hmm. So when you are talking to them, are you making notes or do you record stuff? Or I'm just interested in the process of how you can pull all of this information together when you sit down in front of the keyboard to put together the article. Right.
I write down some questions in the beginning after I've done my research. Then I do record our conversations with that person's permission, because often I'm doing an interview, if not in person, then on Zoom, and I want to be able to maintain eye contact with them and not lose my place. So I've got my questions maybe on another screen or on a piece of paper, which I can refer to, but so I can get back on track if I lose my way. Mm-hmm. But I also want to be able to connect with that person I'm talking to, and if they bring up something that isn't listed on my questions, I want to be able to run with that and say, tell me more about this other thing, because I didn't know this about your job.
So you underscore a point that I find very interesting too, because sometimes I'll do one of these podcast episodes on Zoom, and sometimes the other individual doesn't have their video turned on.
Right.
And in my particular case, I like to see the person that I'm talking to, even though I'm not recording the video of the article, but I like to see them eye to eye when we're talking.
Absolutely, me too. It's having a conversation with somebody, and as an interviewer, you become more relaxed, and the interviewee also becomes more relaxed because they know who they're talking to.
Now, when I talk to folks about their passion, particularly when their passion involves their work, in terms of their career and what they do, I like to take a look at the progression of how they got to where they are from where they were.
Okay.
So if we go back in terms of doing your life story as far as your work life is concerned, I'd like to sort of get some sense as to the lessons you learned about writing as you did these various jobs, and if I can sort of abbreviate some of the responsibilities you may have had at different places. So you started off as I noticed working for the Schizophrenia Society, putting together pamphlets and manuals.
Yes.
So in terms of your writing career, this would be near the beginning.
Yes.
And so what sorts of things were on your mind as you are doing that particular writing?
For that organization, it was for families of people living with serious mental illness like schizophrenia. So I was helping write pamphlets that were easy to understand, accessible, sometimes talking about medical jargon that people were new to, or, weren't very familiar with, and trying to help them understand and give them some guidance. So maybe a little bit of reassurance, but writing clearly. That was something my dad always taught me and taught his students is how to write clearly and succinctly. But again, writing a pamphlet, what are your main points? What are you going to leave out? So I think that was maybe my first editing job.
And you have even less space in a pamphlet than you do in an article in a magazine.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
The next step, you're working for the city's Social Planning Council, and
Yes.
One of the responsibilities you had was writing grant applications.
Yes.
So for anybody involved in nonprofit organizations, that's a really important part of what they
It
have
is.
to do
It
if
is.
they're looking for money to do the work that they're doing. So talk to me about writing grant applications.
The focus there is a really good lesson I've taken into all my work as you're writing for your audience. And in this case, somebody is going to look at your grant application. They have a pot of money. They have rules for whom they're going to give to, how they want you to report if you have a successful application. So writing for your audience, so making an appealing application that addresses a grantor's or funder's demands. So, here's our program, here's what we'll fund, here's what we won't fund. Tell us why you think your project fits with this program. So answering all their questions, but trying to be a little bit extra to make yourself make your application stand out from the many, many other applications that funder is going to receive.
And it's a job I wouldn't want to have as being on the other end of that, trying to decide
me neither.
who gets
No.
the money. Yeah. You went on to work with the Chamber of Commerce,
Yes.
writing policy papers for
Yes.
the Chamber, and having been a member of the Chamber and been on the executive at one particular point, I know that that's not an easy job.
No.
And I actually came across a video of you talking to, I think it was City Council,
Probably.
about something. I'm sure it was when you were with the Chamber. Yes. So this is the political side of writing to a
Yes.
certain degree. So tell me about that experience working there.
Well, I think in that case, I was sort of dabbling in policy, but just in a small way. It really wasn't my forte, but. So I can't really think of any specific documents that I did, but what I did do was find a bit more of a passion in another direction, which was to start writing profiles of community businesses and organizations. Mm-hmm. So I started, because the Chamber of Commerce used to run Pitch in Kingston, which is an annual community cleanup day. Yeah. So I approached one of the local newspapers, Kingston This Week, to see if we could partner, and I would write stories on classes, organizations, businesses. I think there was a class at RMC, and I would write about what they were doing to help the community in sort of a green way. Whether it was just, their pitching Kingston activities or what they were doing year-round in terms of conservation or recycling, that sort of thing. And I really enjoyed doing that. So I think that was my, forte rather than the policy pieces.
You went on to work at Queen's for Queen's alumni and spent a fair amount of time there. Mm-hmm. So that's a totally different approach to writing, I would guess. Yeah. So for writing for the Queen's alumni audience, again, so I did two different kinds of writing. I would write about upcoming events or that sort of thing to appeal to people to join an alumni event in Kingston or in another community. And I would also do profiles of alumni for the website and later for the alumni magazine. So that was the skills I learned there were very important, because sometimes if you're an alumnus and you're being approached by your alma mater to say, oh, you've got a very distinguished career, we'd like to interview you. Sometimes people have predisposed ideas about what the questions are going to be. I was like, okay, so they want me to talk about how my alma mater and my education got me to where I was today. Mm-hmm. And that can be a very interesting story. But if you tell it 100 times, it ceases to become a very interesting story to the reader who's going to read the same sort of thing. And so what I found there was, keep in mind from my previous work, keep your audience in mind. And your audience is the reader as well as the interviewee. So I learned to discuss with interviewees, here's where I want to go with this article. Here's the end result. Here's what I want the reader to know about you. Let's discuss what questions you're comfortable with, or let's discuss what stories you want to discuss, because sometimes it's not the story of, oh, I got my degree, I got my first job, then I made my first million, and da-da-da. Readers want to know about, what else happened. Yeah. Okay, we know your success. What about your failures? What about the things you struggled with? What can I relate to? So being very transparent with interviewees and saying, this is what I want to do with this story about you. It makes them comfortable, and it makes, I think, for a better story. That brings us up to current day, which is the work you are doing with Tourism Kingston.
Mm-hmm. So at Tourism Kingston, I'm an editor and a writer, and I work on a number of things, including some profiles. Again, I'm still interviewing interesting people, either who live in Kingston or who come to Kingston. I recently interviewed Jill Barber, the musician, who's coming to Kingston. Oh, no, she was just here recently at the Isabel Bader Center. But I also work on documents, annual plans, business plans, and also grant proposals still. But I also work on bid documents for Tourism Kingston, which can be very interesting. And this is sort of a new thing to my portfolio. So I work with colleagues in business events or sport and wellness who are bringing or hope to bring large groups to Kingston, either a tournament or a sport group or a conference. So cities have to put in bids for various events, and you have to say, well, you should come to Kingston next year because here are our hotels, here are our services, here are our attractions. So I work with my colleagues in those portfolios to, again, it's almost like submitting a grant application. You have to cover all your bases, answer all the questions that the association or the business wants to hear from potential host cities. And then you have to do a little something extra to make it stand out.
Now, for those folks who don't live in Kingston, tourism is a big thing. It's a very big part of the economy of the city.
It is. It's estimated that about 10% of the Kingston workforce works in tourism or related organization, restaurants, hotels, museums, that sort of thing.
Let's go back over the last many years and get you to tell me what you figure your favorite story was, the favorite article that you've written going back.
Oh, my goodness. So I interviewed Jill Barber recently, and I connected with her through Virginia Clark at the Grad Club, and I was interviewing Virginia for another project. And this is also a great hook, is ask people, who know other people to introduce you.
I know it well.
So I was interviewing Jill, who was coming to Kingston for a concert, and I was talking to her about the Grad Club because I was writing a piece on the Grad Club for a walking tour project.
So the Grad Club, for those who may not know, is a restaurant on the campus of Queen's University.
Yeah, so it's run by the Society of Graduate and Professional Students. So it's got a bar, it's got a kitchen, it's got event space for graduate students, but it also has become very well known as a great place for live music. It's a really tiny space, so it's a very intimate space, but a lot of very famous Canadian musicians and bands have played there, and a lot of people got their start there. So I was discussing with Jill her upcoming concert, and Virginia had said, ask her about how she got her start. So I asked Jill. And so Jill has become a very well-known Canadian singer. She does a jazz pop kind of music, but her older brother Matthew has also become a very well-known Canadian singer, and they've done some duets together and some tours together. So I said, when was the first time you played the Grad Club? And she said, well, I was actually visiting my brother Matthew. I was 16 years old, and he was a Queen's student, so he took me to the Grad Club, and they had an open mic night. So she said, so I got up on stage and I sang a song by Weeping Tile, which is a well-known Kingston band. And that was my very first live performance. And she described how it sort of ignited a spark in her. And she's like, I love performing in front of people. Mm-hmm. She knew she had loved music, and she wrote music as a teenager, but she hadn't had that experience before. So she's gone on to become a very, very well-known performer and singer. So that was really cool that she shared that little moment with me.
That's the fun part of doing those kinds of conversations, is getting those little stories and pulling them out and seeing the enthusiasm in how they tell the story, which makes your particular article or a podcast more interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I write about that, I don't have the advantage of hearing people's voices, so I have to try and bring it alive on the page or on the screen with, descriptors.
Which is a whole different skill.
Yeah.
When you're writing, generally speaking, do you have a sense as to how much of what you write is for entertainment purposes as opposed to providing information?
Oh, good question. I think they're equally balanced. I'm really, information you can take in two ways. I'm very, very fixated on getting the facts right. So I'm always fact checking. I'm always researching. So I want, as I've said before, the interviewee to be happy that I've represented them appropriately. But again, information, I want the reader at the end of reading the piece to do something, to either feel something or to say, oh, I've got to go see that musician. Now I've read about them. I understand their spark. I understand their passion. I really should go see them. But sometimes it's just, here's a person and here's their life. And all you have to, the action at the end of reading that article is just like, wow, I didn't know that.
For those folks who receive the information, whether it's for entertainment purposes or to glean the facts or whatever, from a writer's perspective, there have been a lot of changes over the last 20 plus years in how you do your job and how you get the word out from you sitting in front of your keyboard. So we have the commonly accepted way, which is print for a writer, is to get something written down. There are people who use video and audio, and there's also the impact of social media. And I'm wondering if how has that all worked into the way you do your job? Is all of these changes in terms of getting the information out?
Well, I'm lucky in that I work with a team who does a lot of that for me. So if I write a piece, I don't have to worry a lot about pushing it out on social media. What I will do is think about the lead to the story to make it sort of SEO friendly or social media friendly. So I might write a couple of different intros to fit different media. But other than that, I think I still stick to basics on how to write a story.
Do you get the impression that people will read your articles more online than in picking up at the magazine or a newspaper or a pamphlet or whatever? I'm just trying to get a sense of where we are these days in terms of getting information.
I think probably online is the way most people get it. I still love print magazines. I worked for 7 years at Queen's as editor of the Alumni magazine. And the reason I like magazines from a reader's perspective is when you pick it up, you don't know what you're going to get. And you don't know what the end of that article is going to be. If you're looking for a story online, or if you're following an organization online, you may read their stories because you're a follower, but you will pick out those stories online that you want to read. This one has a catchy headline. I'm going to read that one and not read the other one. It's the same in print. You have to have catchy headlines. You have to have great graphics. You have to have something that compels the person to read it. But there's something about turning a page and discovering, oh, this looks interesting. What's this about? Physics? Well, I would never seek out a story on physics online if I was just scrolling through Instagram or something. But this looks cool. So there's that element of surprise I like.
You've sort of alluded to something that I was going to finish up with in terms of those people who are sitting down and writing, learning how to write, looking to get a job in writing, and the importance of, you mentioned graphics and fonts and colors, and I was talking to someone else about putting together a pamphlet or a page, and there has to be only so much regular writing before you put in a picture or a font or a graphic or something to keep someone's attention when they're reading something. And planning out a story, you sort of alluded to some of these points in the context of our conversation, but when someone is sitting down to write a story, first thing they should be thinking about when they're writing the story?
Well, it depends on, what medium it's going through, but if you're writing a pamphlet or writing something for social media, I think don't worry about the end product, what it's going to look like. Think about what it's going to feel like, and then start writing. And then you can see when it starts to take shape how much of that feeling can come across through your writing. and how much may need a little boost at the end through graphics or a photo, that kind of thing. But don't try and do all the heavy lifting all at once. I mean, you can't write for every reader, but you can. So for instance, when I was writing for the Queen's magazine, and I would write a lot about, physics and science and areas in which I had no prior knowledge. So I would write something about, say, a physicist, and I would know that most of my audience would not have a background in physics. Some would have, some scientific knowledge, and a small proportion were physicists. So I better get it right. So yeah, as you write, you want to make it accessible for the non-scientist, but not talk down to them. Mm-hmm. You want to make it interesting for the scientists, but not presume to tell them their subject.
Yeah.
So often how that comes about is you focus on the person who's doing the research, their personality, how they approach their job. And along the way, you can tell a story about the science and have the reader at the end of that article know a little bit more about physics, so that's the topic, and a little bit more about that person and feel engaged with both.
Still enjoy writing?
Absolutely. It's a struggle sometimes. Sometimes you just stare at a blank screen, or I do, and it just, this thing is not writing itself. I don't know why.
So when's the book coming out?
Give me another year.
Okay. We'll talk back in another year.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thanks for your time, Andrea. Really appreciate
David.
it. Our guest in this episode, Andrea Gunn, a writer and editor with Tourism Kingston. This conversation was recorded in May of 2023. For more information, check out her profile on LinkedIn. To those of you listening, thank you, and I'll be back soon.
The theme music for the podcast is Stace's Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to the Kingstonian Podcast at gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.